The steel crank handle hit Tom Hendricks square in the chest with the force of a kicked mule. 1 second, he was rotating the Farmel's engine through another compression stroke. The next, he was on his back in the dirt, ribs screaming, lungs empty, staring up at the rafters of his equipment shed while his vision narrowed to a tunnel. The handle had kicked back so fast he never saw it coming. This was February 1952 in rural Wisconsin, and Tom had just learned the lesson that killed or crippled a dozen farmers every winter. You could hand crank a tractor for 20 years without incident. Get comfortable, get confident, and then one frozen morning the engine would remind you that 3,000 pounds of cast iron didn't care about your experience. The machine played by physics, and physics always won. He lay there gasping like a landed fish, trying to remember how breathing worked. The Farmel sat above him, silent and indifferent, its engine cold and dead. Somewhere in the house, his wife Sarah was making breakfast. His 2 sons were getting ready for school. The dairy cows in the barn needed milking. 80 head of cattle needed feeding. 200 acres of winter wheat needed checking after last night's ice storm. And Tom couldn't move. 5 minutes passed before he could pull enough air into his lungs to sit up. 10 minutes before he could stand, leaning against the tractor's wheel, feeling his ribs with shaking hands. Nothing broken, probably, just badly bruised. He'd been lucky. His neighbor Frank Morrison had taken a starting handle to the skull 3 years back and died before his wife found him. Ed Patterson down in Walworth County had lost his left eye. Jimmy Coleman's boy had a permanent limp from a shattered kneecap. The really terrifying part? Tom knew exactly what he'd done wrong. He'd been in a hurry. The cows were waiting, the day's work was piling up, and he'd advanced the spark timing too far before the engine was warm. Classic mistake. The kind of mistake that happened when you thought you knew better than the machine, when you let urgency override caution, when you forgot that a hand-cranked tractor didn't forgive errors. He looked at the crank handle lying on the ground where it had fallen after hitting him. 3 feet of curved steel, 15 pounds of potential energy waiting to be released. Every farmer in America knew this tool intimately. Every farmer had a story. The handles were designed to break away on kickback, a safety feature that worked maybe half the time. The other half, they stayed engaged just long enough to break bones or crack skulls. Tom picked up the handle, his hands still shaking. The cows were bellowing in the barn. He could hear them through the wall, demanding attention that wouldn't wait. He had maybe 30 minutes before his sons left for school, and he needed their help with the morning feeding. The tractor had to start. Had to. There was no plan B on a working farm in winter. He checked the spark timing, making absolutely certain it was fully retarded this time. He pulled the choke out, set the throttle at idle, and positioned himself at the crank with his feet planted properly. Left foot forward, right foot back, weight distributed, thumb alongside his fingers instead of wrapped around the handle. Every movement deliberate, every precaution taken. The first pull rotated the engine slowly through a full compression cycle. Tom could feel each of the 4 cylinders resisting, cold oil clinging to every surface, pistons dragging through their bores like they were moving through mud. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees overnight, and the engine block held that cold like a grudge. He cranked again, putting his shoulders into it, using his legs to drive the motion. The flywheel's mass fought him. 200 pounds of cast iron that didn't want to move. Pull, reset, pull, reset, pull, reset. The rhythm was automatic after 23 years of farming, but tonight every pull sent pain shooting through his bruised ribs. By the 10th crank, sweat was running down his back despite the freezing air. By the 15th, his arms felt like lead. The engine hadn't given him so much as a cough, just cold dead resistance that made him wonder if he'd damaged something when the handle kicked back. Maybe bent a valve, maybe cracked something in the timing mechanism. Maybe created a problem that would cost money he didn't have to fix. He paused to catch his breath, and that's when he heard Sarah's footsteps approaching the shed. She appeared in the doorway, took one look at his face, and knew immediately what had happened. 26 years of marriage gave her that kind of vision. She didn't ask if he was hurt. She could see he was hurt. She asked the only question that mattered. How bad? Ribs. Nothing broken. He straightened up, despite the pain, proving he could. Tractor won't start. She studied the Farmel like it was a sick animal, which in a way it was. You want John to try? John was their oldest, 17 and strong as a young bull. No, The answer came fast and hard. Tom had watched too many fathers hand down injuries along with farm knowledge. "I'll get it. Just need to warm it up first." Sarah disappeared and returned 5 minutes later with a kerosene heater and a top. Together they draped the tarp over the engine and positioned the heater underneath, creating a makeshift warming tent. This was the old-timers' trick for desperate cold mornings, and it burned through expensive kerosene. But sometimes you had no choice. The engine needed heat before it would even think about starting. While they waited, Sarah went back to the house and returned with a pot of coffee and 2 heavy blankets. She wrapped one around Tom's shoulders and poured him a cup of coffee hot enough to burn. They stood together in the cold shed, not talking, just being present, the way farm couples learn to be present. Words couldn't fix a bulky tractor or bruised ribs, but coffee and company helped. 30 minutes later, Tom pulled the tarp off and felt the engine block. Still cold, but no longer frozen solid. He positioned the crank handle, said a quick prayer that his father had taught him, and began cranking again. This time, the engine rotated more freely, oil thinned just enough by the heat to stop clinging quite so desperately to every moving part. On the 7th pull, he got a cough from one cylinder. On the 9th, 2 cylinders fired briefly. On the 11th, the engine caught and held, running rough and uneven, but running. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The whole tractor shook like it might disintegrate. But the starter job was done. Tom stood there breathing hard, ribs protesting every breath, and let the engine warm at idle. Sarah had already gone back to the house to get the boys moving. In 20 minutes they'd be out to help with feeding, and he needed to be ready. He climbed onto the tractor seat despite the pain, and sat there while the engine smoothed out, thinking about what had just happened. This was the reality that nobody talked about when they sold you a tractor. The salesman showed up in clean suits and shiny shoes, talking about horsepower and efficiency and modern farming. They demonstrated how the machine would pull a 4-bottom plow through any soil. They calculated how many acres you could work in a day compared to a horse team. They made it sound like buying a tractor was buying freedom from drudgery. What they didn't mention was that the tractor itself became a kind of drudgery. Every cold morning brought this same battle. Every winter carried the risk of injury. Every breakdown meant you were dependent on parts that might take weeks to arrive. You traded one set of problems for another and called it progress because you didn't have any choice. The world was changing, and farmers who didn't change with it went broke. Tom's father had farmed with horses until 1947, convinced that tractors were a passing fad for farmers with more money than sense. Then commodity prices had crashed, labor costs had soared, and suddenly you either mechanized or you sold out. The old man had bought a used farmall with cash he'd saved for retirement and had spent his final years learning to curse machinery instead of horses. The engine finally warmed enough for work. Tom engaged the transmission and drove the tractor out of the shed into the pale dawn light. His sons were already in the barn. He could hear them moving around, getting feed ready. The dairy cows had gone quiet now that help was clearly coming. The day's work stretched ahead, and none of it was going to wait for bruised ribs to heal. He spent the morning doing what farmers had always done, working through pain, because the alternative was not working at all. The cattle needed feeding regardless of how Tom felt. The dairy cows needed milking on schedule, or their production would drop. The equipment needed maintenance, whether convenient or not. This was the iron rule of farm life, the unforgiving reality that shaped every decision and defined every day. By noon, his ribs hurt so badly he could barely lift his arms. Sarah took one look at him when he came in for lunch and pointed at the phone. "Call Doc Patterson, that's not just bruising." Tom started to argue, then realized she was right. The pain was getting worse, not better, and he couldn't afford to turn bruised ribs into broken ones by being stubborn. He called the doctor, who told him to come in immediately. Sarah drove him to town while the boys handled the afternoon feeding, and 3 hours later, Tom was back home with his entire torso wrapped in tape and instructions to avoid heavy lifting for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. On a working farm in winter. It might as well have been 2 years. Tom sat at the kitchen table that evening, taped up like a mummy, watching his sons do the evening chores through the window. They were capable boys, John especially, but they were still learning. They didn't have the instinct yet, The ability to read animals and equipment and weather that only came from years of experience. "We'll manage," Sarah said, reading his thoughts like she always did. "John can handle the tractor work. Bobby can do the feeding. I'll handle the dairy, it's only 2 weeks." But it wasn't just 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks of watching his farm being run by other people while he sat useless at the kitchen table. It was 2 weeks of worrying that John would make the same mistake he'd made, would get hurt the same way, would learn the hard lessons at the same brutal cost. It was 2 weeks of wondering if there was a better way to do this, a safer way, a way that didn't require risking your life just to start your equipment. The next morning, Tom stood in the shed doorway, wrapped in tape and frustration, watching John prepare to start the farm all. The boy had the stance right, feet positioned properly, thumb alongside his fingers on the handle. Tom had drilled that into both his sons from the time they were old enough to reach the crank. But knowledge and instinct were different things, and instinct only came from experience that Tom desperately didn't want his sons to gain. John cranked the engine methodically, using proper form, taking his time. 15 pulls, 20, 25. The cold engine resisted stubbornly, giving nothing back. Tom could see the boy's frustration building, could see him starting to rush, starting to take shortcuts. He wanted to step in, wanted to take over, but his taped ribs reminded him why that was impossible. "Don't advance the spark yet," Tom called out. "Keep it retarded until she's warm." John nodded, adjusted his approach, kept cranking. On the 32nd pull, the engine coughed. On the 35th, it caught and held. John had done it correctly, safely, without injury. But Tom could see the exhaustion in his son's face, could see him rubbing his shoulders, could see the beginning of the long relationship with mechanical stubbornness that defined tractor farming. That day passed, and the next, and the one after that. John started the tractor every morning, and every morning Tom watched from the doorway, unable to help, forced to trust that his teaching had been adequate. The farm work continued. The cattle got fed, the dairy cows got milked. Life went on because on a farm, life always went on regardless of injury or illness or inconvenience. But something had shifted in Tom's mind. He'd been farming with tractors for 23 years, had started engines in weather that ranged from blazing summer heat to sub-zero winter cold, had broken down and rebuilt more machinery than he could count. He'd accepted hand cranking as the price of mechanical farming, the same way you accepted calluses as the price of working with your hands. Now watching his 17-year-old son struggle with that same cold crank every morning, Tom started wondering if acceptance was the same as surrender. The agricultural magazines he read were full of advertisements for tractors with electric starters. Push a button, turn a key, and the engine sprang to life like magic. No cranking, no kickback, no risk of injury. The cost was dependence on batteries and electrical systems, and that dependence bothered Tom deeply. His hand-crank farm-all was simple. If something broke, he could fix it with basic tools and farm shop skills. Electric starters meant complicated wiring, voltage regulators, generators, batteries that could die in cold weather. It meant calling mechanics for problems he couldn't solve himself. It meant being dependent on systems he didn't fully understand. But dependence on complexity was starting to look better than independence at the cost of injury. Tom had been lucky. He'd taken a chest hit that could easily have been a headshot, 6 inches higher, and Sarah would have been a widow. His sons would have been running the farm without him, all because he'd been in a hurry one cold morning. On the 5th day of his forced inactivity, Tom's neighbor, Carl Mueller, stopped by with news that made the decision easier. Frank Morrison's youngest boy, David, had been hand-cranking their John Deere that morning when the handle kicked back and broke his right arm in 3 places. 16 years old, full of strength and confidence, and the tractor had crippled him in a single instant. "That's the 4th injury this winter in our township alone," Carl said, sitting at Tom's kitchen table with coffee. "Frank's talking about selling out, moving to town. Says he can't watch his kids get hurt anymore." Tom thought about his own sons, thought about John out there every morning wrestling with the crank handle, thought about how many more winters of this ritual stretched ahead. 20 years, 30, how many close calls before luck ran out, how many cold mornings before someone in his family ended up like David Morrison, or worse. That night, Tom pulled out the Alice Chalmers catalogue that had been sitting in his desk drawer for 3 months. He'd requested it back in November, curious about the new models, but had never seriously considered buying one. The WD-45 model stared at him from the glossy pages, promising electric starting, power steering, and all the modern conveniences that made farming easier. The price made his stomach hurt worse than his ribs. $3,200 for the tractor, another $500 for implements. It was more money than he'd spent on equipment in the previous 5 years combined. It was money that could go toward land improvements, toward college funds for his boys, toward 100 different needs that always competed for limited resources on a working farm. But how much was safety worth? How much would he pay to know that his sons could start the tractor without risking their lives? What was the price of sleeping soundly instead of lying awake, wondering if tomorrow would be the day someone got seriously hurt? Sarah found him at the kitchen table at midnight, staring at the catalogue, doing calculations on a notepad. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on his shoulder and looked at the numbers with him. They'd made every major farm decision together for 26 years, and this would be no different. "We can afford it," she said finally. "It'll be tight, but we can manage. It means depending on batteries, on electrical systems, on mechanics for repairs I can't handle. It means our sons can start the tractor without breaking bones. Everything else is details." She was right. Tom knew she was right. But accepting it meant admitting that the self-reliance he'd prized his entire farming life had limits. It meant acknowledging that some kinds of independence weren't worth the cost. It meant choosing dependence on technology over independence at the price of safety. The next morning, still taped up and aching, Tom called the Alice Chalmers dealer in Madison. The WD-45 would take 6 weeks to arrive. 6 more weeks of hand cranking, 6 more weeks of risk, 6 more weeks of watching his sons fight cold engines every morning. But after that, the daily battle would end. After that, starting the tractor would be as simple as turning a key. The weeks crawled by. Tom healed slowly, his ribs gradually remembering how to work without pain. He watched his sons master the hand crank ritual, becoming more efficient with each morning's battle. John could now start the farm all in 20 cranks instead of 35. Bobby was learning the feel of compression, the rhythm of the work. They were becoming competent tractor farmers, the same way Tom had become competent, through daily struggle and accumulated experience. But that competence came with injuries Tom could see developing. John's right shoulder was starting to bother him, strained from the repetitive cranking motion. Bobby had smashed his thumb between the handle and the engine block one morning and spent 3 days with it bandaged. Small injuries, minor pain, the kind of thing you work through because that's what farmers did. But Tom remembered how his own small injuries had accumulated over the years, how his back had developed a permanent ache, how his hands were gnarled from 1,000 minor damages. Was this what he wanted for his sons? Was passing down mechanical knowledge worth passing down mechanical injury? The questions haunted him through February and into March, as winter slowly released its grip on Wisconsin and the WD-45's arrival date approached. The tractor arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-March, delivered on a flatbed truck that looked impossibly modern against the backdrop of Tom's weathered barn. The driver helped unload it using ramps and careful maneuvering, and then there it sat in Tom's farmyard, gleaming with fresh paint and possibility. The Alice Chalmers orange seemed almost too bright, too optimistic, like it belonged in a showroom instead of a working farm. Tom walked around it slowly, examining every detail. The electric starter button sat prominently on the instrument panel. A battery box housed the 6-volt electrical system. A generator mounted on the engine would keep the battery charged during operation. It was complex machinery, dependent on systems Tom didn't fully understand. But it was also the future, whether he liked it or not. He climbed onto the seat, feeling strange in this unfamiliar cockpit. Everything was positioned differently from the farm all. The controls were in new places. The whole machine felt foreign, like he was sitting in someone else's tractor. But when he pushed the starter button, the engine turned over immediately, catching on the 3rd revolution and settling into a smooth idle that his hand-crank farm all had never achieved, even on warm days. No cranking, no exhaustion, no risk of kickback, just mechanical power available instantly at the push of a button. Tom sat there listening to the engine run, feeling like he'd betrayed something fundamental about farming, even as he recognized that this was progress. This was safety. This was the choice he'd made for his family's welfare. John came out of the barn and stopped dead when he saw the new tractor running. His face went through a series of expressions, surprise giving way to excitement, giving way to something that looked almost like relief. He walked over slowly, like approaching a wild animal, and looked up at his father sitting in the seat. "No more cranking?" he asked. "No more cranking," Tom confirmed. The boy's face split into a grin so wide it made Tom's chest hurt worse than his injured ribs ever had. In that grin he saw relief from daily struggle, freedom from morning battles with cold steel, release from a burden that John had carried without complaint, but clearly resented. His son was happy. His family would be safer. Everything else was negotiable. They spent that afternoon learning the new tractor's systems together, father and sons exploring this modern machine that would reshape their daily routines. The electric starter was just the beginning. Power steering made the tractor easier to control. A live power takeoff meant you could disengage the transmission without stopping implement operation. Hydraulic lift controls simplified connecting implements. Every system represented a choice between mechanical simplicity and operational convenience. And Alice Chalmers had chosen convenience at every decision point. Tom taught his sons about batteries, about checking water levels, about keeping terminals clean and connections tight. He explained how the generator worked, how the voltage regulator prevented overcharging, how the whole electrical system depended on proper maintenance. It was knowledge different from what he'd learned from his father, knowledge that came from books and manuals instead of hands-on mechanical work. But it was knowledge his sons would need for the future they were inheriting. That evening, the old farmer sat in the equipment shed, silent and obsolete. Tom walked out after dinner and stood looking at it in the fading light. 23 years of service, thousands of cold starts, countless hours of faithful work. The tractor had never let him down, had always started eventually, had always done exactly what it was designed to do. It had also nearly killed him and had injured his sons. He ran his hand along the fender, feeling the familiar shape of metal that had been part of his daily life for more than 2 decades. Tomorrow he'd advertise it for sale. Some younger farmer would buy it, would learn the hand crank ritual, would fight the same battles Tom had fought. The cycle would continue because there were still farmers who couldn't afford electric starters, who valued independence over convenience, who believed in mechanical simplicity even at the cost of safety. But Tom's fighting days were done. His family's safety was worth more than his pride in self-reliance. Progress had won, not because it was better in every way, but because the cost of resisting it had become too high. The hand crank era was ending, replaced by electrical dependence that made farming safer, if not simpler. The next morning, Tom woke at 4:30 out of habit and walked out to the equipment shed. The WD-45 sat waiting, orange and modern and ready for work. He climbed onto the seat, pushed the starter button, and the engine sprang to life instantly. No cranking, no struggle, no risk, just power available at the touch of a button. He sat there listening to the engine run, thinking about his father and grandfather, about all the farmers who'd broken their backs and bodies to work the land with whatever tools their era provided. Oxen to horses to tractors, each generation had fought their own battles with their own equipment. His sons would fight different battles with different equipment. Progress meant trading old problems for new ones, and you made the trade because standing still wasn't an option. The sun rose over his fields, painting the frozen ground in shades of gold and orange. Spring planting was coming. The work would continue. The land didn't care what kind of tractor you drove or how you started it. The land only cared that you did the work, that you showed up every morning ready to farm, that you made whatever sacrifices were necessary to keep food growing and families fed. Tom engaged the transmission and drove toward his fields, leaving the hand crank era behind him. Somewhere in Wisconsin and across the Midwest, other farmers were cranking cold engines, fighting the same battles he'd fought for 2 decades. But in his equipment shed, the old farmer sat silent, its starting handle hanging on the bracket like a relic from a harder time. Progress had arrived, expensive and electrical, and dependent on systems that would have seemed like magic to his grandfather. but his sons were safe. That was all that mattered. The rest was just details. Thank you so much for watching this story about the brutal reality of hand-cranking tractors and one farmer's decision to embrace electric starters for his family's safety. If you found Tom's journey from injury to acceptance compelling, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who appreciates authentic American farm history. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real stories about the challenges, dangers, and hard choices that defined rural American life from the 1930s through the 1970s. This video is inspired by real facts and historical farming practices. Tom Hendricks is a representative character who reflects the genuine experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced these exact challenges and made these same difficult decisions during this era. This content is not intended to represent or offend any specific individual or group.